Hey guys, so I wanted to take you through a quick rundown of my book log. I read a lot of my books in ebook and audiobook form, so I like having some sort of reminder of the books that I've read. And so this is what I decided to do. I basically just created like a mini scrapbook. So I'll take you through the books that I've read pretty quickly. All the Bright Places was a really wonderful and earnest novel. I feel like it did such a good job of talking about difficult topics surrounding mental health, bipolar disorder, and suicide. If that's something that you are struggling with, I would maybe stay away from this one just because I do find that it can be a bit triggering. But if you are curious about how to talk to people who have mental health issues, in a, I want to say, more real and authentic way, definitely something to check out. The Alex Verus series is basically a Harry Potter detective novel, which I really enjoyed. Dresden Files is less Harry Potter and more like Buffy the Vampire Slayer detective novel. I do love the series. This one book just didn't really do it for me. Little Black Book is a wonderful sort of blog-like book about running your own business, particularly as a woman. So I really enjoyed that. The information in it wasn't particularly groundbreaking, but it felt like a really nice reminder. All the Old Knives was a book I read in one day on our camping trip, and so I liked having the physical book and then being able to take a picture of it, where we were staying and where I had read it. It's a really neat book that takes place over the course of a dinner between two former lovers who were also international spies. Unfuck Yourself is another blog style book. I read this for book club. It didn't feel like it hit, and I feel like if I had been a bit more in the headspace to read it, or felt like I needed it, I maybe would have enjoyed it more. The Art of Memoir was another wonderful book about writing about yourself. There were a lot of references in here that I didn't get necessarily because I don't read memoirs, but there was still so much useful information. The Invention of Nature is about Alexander von Humboldt, who was a huge inspiration for Charles Darwin, who I really admire, and I admire a lot of his work. But Humboldt was one of the first people to talk about nature as a collective, cohesive system instead of just flora and fauna that needed to be categorized. So it was really cool to learn about him and learn about his life story. David Copperfield is a cultural vegetable. You read it because you're supposed to. I thought it would be about a magician. It was not. The Universe Has Your Back. Just, to me, it was more about wishful thinking and less about practical advice, and so it just didn't resonate with me. That being said, I have a lot of Gabrielle Bernstein's cards that go by the same name, I believe, and I find them really useful in terms of meditating on. Crime and Punishment was an audiobook, and I'm not sure if it was the Russianness of it all, but it didn't connect with me in any meaningful way. To Kill a Mockingbird, another classic. I was probably going through a list of classics to read or something. Was a difficult read, and it was difficult reading it as a parent, thinking about all the things that Atticus had to deal with. Black Chalk was a really fun book about a game that a group of students sets up in college, sort of like secret societies and mystery and murder. Well, maybe murder, you know. And I don't know, it felt really well written and really well thought out. Shift is a book that my husband and I read to each other, or this is one in a series of books about these silos that are buried underground. And I think it took us probably the better part of a year to read this, but it was so enjoyable and we had such a blast. And despite the fact that there are only 2 characters in the whole book, it never gets boring. It's never obvious. It's just, I don't know, it's so well written. So I'm looking forward to the next one. The Awakening, another classic, one of those books that sort of makes you wonder, like, why did this have to be written? Because, women have complicated feelings. How could that possibly be true? But then you realize that Kate Chopin was doing some really interesting work that wasn't being done by other people at the time. The Hate You Give was a struggle, and a struggle in an emotional sense. It makes me so sad that this is the world we live in, and it really is the state of how things are for minority groups, particularly in America. And again, as a parent, it was just very hard to read, but I would recommend it, absolutely. Mara, Daughter of the Nile was like the YA when I was growing up. Less murdering each other, more subterfuge and overthrowing Egyptian empires. This was just a card that I got from the Feed Your Craft book kit that they did. Excuse me. They did a collection of stamps and a bunch of other cards, so I had to get that. The Hatchet is interesting because it's one of the first books I remember seeing when I moved to Canada. I'd never seen anything like it in Serbia. The cover didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't figure out what it was, what a hatchet was. And I'd sort of forgotten about it. And I recently found a list of books that I wanted to read when I was like 13 or 14. And so I decided to pick it up. It was fine. Again, I'm not the intended audience, but it felt really good to be able to read and understand it. Iris Apfel is my hero. This book is just colorful. It's all about her. It's about her life, and it's just pardon me. It's just so inspiring. If you're interested in her at all, I would absolutely recommend it. The Blondes was sort of a letdown because it's one of those books that never really ends. It's about a plague that strikes blonde women, natural or dyed, and about a young woman who finds herself living through that plague. But it just, you never find out what happens. And that it was a disappointment, basically. Carpe Diem was really great because it basically confirmed some of my own personal beliefs. And it basically talks about what it actually means to seize the day and how we need to give ourselves a bit of a break. Beauty and the Beast is one of my favorite Disney stories, so to read this, which is a retelling that focuses a lot more on Beauty's life before she met Beast, was really fun. And I do hear that there's a second book that focuses on maybe her child. Along Came a Spider was one of the few books that I've reread in my life. I remember my dad taking me to see this movie probably when it was wildly inappropriate for me to watch it. And so I wanted to read it for that. Again, it was quick. It was James Patterson. It was nothing to write home about, but I also watched the movie, which ended up being nothing like the book. The Hunchback of... This was nothing like the movie. I'm not sure why I expected it to be like the movie, but it was so interesting to see how Disney plucked little bits of the story and made them into something completely different. What I will say was that I learned that Victor Hugo actually locked himself in his room and burned all of his clothes so that he wouldn't be tempted to go outside while he was writing this book. And that was more interesting to me. Like, it gave me a new perspective on this. And one of the things that I was constantly wondering about was, why is he spending so much time describing Paris? And a girlfriend of mine who was an English major said, you realize they didn't have Google Maps. Which, I paused and was like, oh, right. like the expectation was that you wouldn't be a tourist in Notre Dame, so you needed to have it described to you. And given recent events, I'm really glad I read this. Maeve Binchie's Light a Penny Candle. I read this over Christmas, and I honestly didn't expect to like it, but it was such an accurate portrayal of female relationships, and for that alone, I would recommend it. I also did not expect the ending. I definitely wanted to know more. Tangleweed and Brine is a bunch of retellings of fairy tales. Sorry, I'm just gonna grab a drink of water. I don't know what's happening. Tangleweed and Brine is a retelling of a bunch of fairy tales, and what is really interesting is that you sort of feel like you've heard these stories a lot. And this does such a good job of giving a whole new perspective. For example, Cinderella, instead of going to the ball, waits for everyone to leave so she can ride away on her horse because she's sick and tired of dealing with people. And then Lost Souls, which this book made me mad. And it made me mad because it felt exploitative, I guess. I really didn't know who it was for. Like, if it was for teenagers, it's not really about a life lesson. It's just shitty things happening to people for the entirety of the book. And I don't know. I mean, it wasn't my favorite, but to each their own. So that is it. That's just a quick flip through. It was really fun to put together. It was really fun to take time after each book to take a moment and reflect. And I'm excited to start filling up another notebook. So hopefully you enjoyed. If you have any questions, of course, leave me a comment down below and I'll do my best to get back to you. Thanks so much. Bye.